This story takes place about 5 years ago. I was 18 at the time, had just gotten my license, and wanted to explore. My friends and I would spend weekends exploring the area's abandoned or supposedly haunted buildings. We were thrill seekers, and doing this in a rural location was exciting. Being in the middle of nowhere was thrilling to us. I told my uncle about some of the adventures my friends and I would go on, and he told me that when he was my age, he did similar things with his friends. He described a small shack on Kensington Road in Michigan, about 40 minutes from my house. He said that when he was younger, he and his friends heard all kinds of rumors about a cult that would inhabit the grounds and do rituals with blood and goat carcasses. This sounded like a fake cult story, but it piqued our interest. One night, they drove to Kensington in hopes of something exciting happening, and they got just that. As they arrived, a man came out to the street with a shotgun and scared them away. As they sped down the dirt road, a deer ran in front of them a little ways down the street, and they flipped their car into a ditch trying to avoid it. The police came and investigated. The man with the shotgun was just a squatter. A few months passed, and my uncle noticed something on Crime Stoppers. A man who had come out to the edge of the road was apparently murdered, and his killer was not known at the moment. The incident made my uncle and his friends not want to go anywhere near that place again. Well, this story interested me. The following weekend, I told my friends about this story, and we decided we wanted to see this shack for ourselves. It wasn't even that far away. I typed in Kensington Road on my Apple Maps app and a few other vital things my uncle said that were close to it. I found the location, and my friends and I set out for an adventure on a Saturday night. The directions were tough to follow. The closer we got to the destination, the fewer cars we saw until there was no other traffic at all. There were just deserted cornfields on both sides of us as far as the eye could see. The paved road we were driving on approached a T intersection with a paved road going to the left and a dirt road going to the right. This was as far as the GPS would take us. The road was dirt, not even shown as a road on any of the maps. We drove on this dirt road for about 3 minutes before we located the shack. It was a small building, nothing impressive. Tiny, slightly larger than a shed. There was no mailbox for this place and no address on the house. The windows were boarded up with wood, and they looked almost uninhabited. We didn't know what we would find, as my uncle had visited the place probably 10 years prior, and it had been a long time since then. The place still gave us the creeps. Perhaps it was because of the boarded-up windows and the absolute lack of life in its surroundings. We pulled over to the side of the road in front of the shack, all afraid to get out and explore. We rolled the windows down and turned the car off to see if we could hear anything. And I swear to you, we heard chanting, like a repetition of words being said. However, we were having trouble discerning what was actually being said or if it was even in English. This gave us absolute chills, but we continued to see what else we could hear. Beneath the chanting, an extremely old broadcast was being played. It sounded like something straight out of a World War II-era radio program. The location and sounds were enough to give us goosebumps, and we left with chills. Now, it doesn't end there. We returned about a week later to hear the same old broadcast playing and nothing else happening. It was such a mysterious location. A few weeks passed, and we decided we'd want to check it out again to see if the thing was still playing. We headed there, feeling more confident now that we weren't surrounded by darkness. We parked the car on the side of the dirt road again, got out, and approached the shack. A friend of mine went around back while I held my ear to the window, trying to see if I could hear anyone inside. As we were investigating, a car drove by. This was strange, mind you. This shack was in the middle of nowhere, on a dirt road, very far away from any other houses. We brushed it off and continued investigating. Not even a minute later, my friend came around and told me we needed to get out of there quickly. He said that the same exact vehicle that drove by from the opposite direction was now coming back. We started to grow more cautious, and again, the car circled back around and drove right past us, never really looking at us, but just kept going around. This was enough to finally get us to snap into our right minds. We ran back to the car and drove out of there. We turned onto the next available street, and, to our surprise, the exact vehicle was now following behind us very closely. We were terrified. We made random turns, but we just couldn't seem to shake them. They followed behind us for at least an hour, but it was probably only 10 minutes, because everything felt like it slowed down in that moment. Eventually, they backed off. It'll definitely be quite some time before we ever decide to talk about the shack on Kensington, let alone ever return there. And if we do ever return there, I'll tell you this, I'm bringing an actual weapon, more than just a stick or a sword, I'll tell you that. I drive trucks for a living here in England. It was one of the only jobs I could pretty much just walk into after being medically discharged from the Army, the Royal Logistics Corps, to be specific, with some intense back problems. I had tried physiotherapy, yoga, acupuncture, all sorts of things, but sitting in the cab of a military truck for so long had really done a number on my spine. It was horrible that I was basically forced into the same line of work, only in the civilian world, and I had no choice but to take a daily regime of strong pain medication just to make it through the days and nights of long-distance truck driving. But that is neither here nor there, I suppose. I had only been working for the company I am with now for about 6 or 7 months when I was driving down this lonely stretch of road just outside of Rotherham in South Yorkshire. There, I see this young woman at the side of the road, bags in hand with her thumb out, like she was looking to hitchhike. It is not like I don't see a good few hitchhikers on my routes. They are much more common than you might expect, especially during the summer months when people can afford to be standing at the side of the road, sometimes for hours at a time, waiting for lifts. I never normally stop for people. I have seen enough horror movies to know that you are inviting trouble on yourself if you just let a total stranger into your truck for long distances, but there was something about this girl that had me slowing down and stopping at the roadside for her. I don't know if it was how young she was or how desperate she looked. She didn't look like the kind of scruffy, hippie type or dodgy cardboard sign holder that I normally see standing out there. So there I was, opening my cab door and helping her climb inside. I asked her where she was looking to go, only to have her reply something like, "Anywhere, just drive." This bothered me a little bit, I will be honest, as I didn't really like the idea of having someone just sitting in my passenger's seat for the unforeseeable future. I am not exactly the most sociable person, and awkward silences are annoying for me at the best of times, let alone when it's with some girl that is half my age. God knows what people would think if they saw me, probably that I was some sort of perv or something. So I asked her again, only rephrasing the question so that I made it clear that I couldn't just have her sitting in my truck for the foreseeable future, as I would be looking for somewhere to stay overnight at some point. I know it sounds a bit mean, but I didn't want to have to properly look after this girl, paying for her food, paying for her hotel room, and all that. I had never picked up a hitchhiker before, but they are usually set on certain places that you can just drop them off at, right? So after a bit of awkward silence, and I made it clear that I loathed those, I asked her why she was on the road. She didn't give me much of anything in the way of specifics, just that she was having trouble at home and needed to get away. I asked her if it was a fight with her parents or a boyfriend or something, and that maybe she should not run away from her problems but go back and fix whatever it was, you know, like address the issue or whatever instead of just straight up avoiding it. But she immediately took issue with the fact that I had asked her about a potential boyfriend, saying she was getting out immediately and if I had any funny ideas about where this was going. That made the whole thing feel even more awkward, and I reassured her that I did in fact have a long-term girlfriend at home and that I certainly was not in the habit of picking up young girls from the side of the road. I am basically explaining that I am not a perv when I see a police car pass us on the road. Nothing unusual, so it barely registers other than for me to make sure I am not over the speed limit or anything. You know, the usual I just saw a police car anxieties. But a moment later, I hear sirens behind me, looking into the rear view to see what appeared to be the very same car, having turned around to follow me, with a view to pull me over. I groan, saying something about hoping my brake lights are not out, something along those lines, and slowly beginning to pull my truck over to the side of the road. This is right when the girl in the passenger seat freaks out and starts pleading with me to not pull over. I mean, not just pleading, but she is begging, obviously getting really panicked at the idea of the police officer. Now, this made me feel bloody nervous. What had she done that made her nervous around the police? And how would that reflect on me if I were caught with her? These questions are whirling around my head, and I just tell her to calm down, that I had absolutely no other choice but to pull over. I was explaining further that I was hardly about to get into a high-speed police pursuit on account of a stranger. She burst into tears at that point, just sinking her head into her hands and weeping, but she doesn't try to run away, nothing like that. So that sort of reassured me that she had not committed some sort of violent crime, or at least that she was not some hardened criminal on the run from the law. I watched the policeman that had pulled me over get out of his car and walk up to the side of my truck, which also happens to be the side that the girl sat on. As soon as he looks through the window, I hear him say something like, "Get out of the truck, Natalie." This obviously has me taken aback. Who the hell was that girl that the police officer was on bloody first-name terms with her? She is crying and sobbing, but looks up at the window and screams, "No," through the glass. The policeman motions for me to wind down my window, and I hesitate for a moment. The girl, this Natalie, is obviously terrified of being arrested or whatever is about to happen. The policeman then says something over his radio, something I didn't catch because the glass is in the way. So to better hear what he's saying, I start winding down the window. It was too late to hear what he said on the radio, but I do hear what he said next. "Your parents called again, Natalie. They're tired of you running away like this, and quite frankly, I'm tired of having to come fetch you every time this happens." I suppose I knew all I needed to know from that, but that's when I heard something weird. I looked on in a kind of grim fascination at what was unfolding. She was saying, "They're not my parents. Why won't any of you understand that?" The girl started to scream. "Every time you drag me back there, they do worse and worse things to me and call it punishment. They say it's for my own good, but it's not. It's not at all." She turns to me, pulling up her sleeve to show me all kinds of burns and scars up her arm. Ones that were so pronounced and gross that I recoiled in disgust and horror. "Please. I am begging you, do not let them take me back. I'll do anything. Please just don't let them take me again." What was I supposed to do? Drive off with this girl and get chased by the police? She could have been mentally ill or something, severely delusional with a self-harm problem, and I am just going to drive off with her in the middle of nowhere so she can run away from her home or something? Besides, I was terrified. Absolutely terrified. Police backup arrived, and when there were enough of them, they dragged the girl out of my truck kicking and screaming before they threw her in the back of a police car and drove away. I tried my best to get some of the police to explain to me what the hell had just happened, and I expected to get some sort of answer along the lines of my previous suspicions, but they just waved me away, told me it was none of my business, and that I should not have been picking up young women from the side of the road anyway. I still do not know what happened to that girl, and I hope she has gotten the treatment she needs, but part of me wonders if I had helped prolong some sort of horrible cycle of abuse, one which the actual police were complicit in. Last night, my boyfriend and I were driving home from Universal Studios in Orlando. We were rerouted away from the route we normally take and found ourselves driving through a completely unfamiliar area, basically in the middle of nowhere. My boyfriend's speedometer is broken on his car, and he has to press a button to reset the miles after he gets gas. This will be especially important soon. We were driving on a deserted road with not a single car in sight. My boyfriend realized we hit the 130-mile mark on his odometer. That means we needed gas, but there was literally not one gas station in sight. I searched on my phone for a gas station nearby, and we found one. It turned out to be closed. In a hurry, we found another gas station 5 minutes up the road. This is where the story truly gets weird. My boyfriend thought he closed his gas cap after he filled up, and we were once again driving along this deserted road. We heard a loud bang and realized he forgot to put the gas cap back on, so we were driving around this dark road looking for the gas cap. He finally pulled over and realized somehow the gas cap was still attached to the car. We got back on track to the other gas station. Out of nowhere, I had a horrible thought about something going wrong at that gas station. I pushed it aside as best as I could because I knew we needed gas, and AAA was not an option where we were. We got to this gas station, and the lights were kind of on. This road literally led to a dead end with a gas station on it. The only way to leave this area was to turn left or go straight out of the gas station. My boyfriend got out of the car to see if we could get gas, and the feeling intensified. I have literally never felt like that in my entire life. My stomach dropped. I have been in very disturbing situations, such as almost being kidnapped twice, being followed home, watching someone being taken away in a body bag after being hit by a car, and even some paranormal situations. I can talk about these sometime in the future, but I have never, ever felt like this before. I saw a white car pulling up the road, and it looked like it was gonna make a left. Keep in mind, there was literally no one on this road. He pulls up, notices my boyfriend, and comes back up with his windows down. I found this very strange, because my boyfriend has a genuinely nice sports car, and my mind immediately went into panic mode. I started screaming my boyfriend's name, and the man realized that someone else was in the car. He turned left and sped off suddenly. Sadly, I did not get his license plate because of how dark it was. The situation frightens me more than you can even imagine. It may not seem too scary, but it was easily one of the most terrifying things to watch because I did not know if I was going to witness my boyfriend being robbed at gunpoint or something like that. The feeling and thought I just had 10 minutes earlier are what also made this situation even worse. We found a gas station with actual human life around, and we made it home safe and sound. Once I got home, my dad told me that the road we were driving on was famous for many bodies being found on it. I hope no one gets put in that situation. Be safe out there, my friends. Although what I'm about to tell you may sound like one of your run-of-the-mill horror movies, I swear to the validity of it and what I saw. It all started on an extremely hot July day this past year. My car is almost 20 years old and sometimes overheats on hot days, just like this one. However, until I get a better paying job, it is the car I'm stuck with. That day, I was driving through the back roads, looking for a family of dog breeders a friend had told me about. I had been searching for the place for several hours and was approaching the warmest part of the day. As usual, my car began overheating, and I was forced to pull over. I picked up my phone to call my girlfriend only to see that my battery was dead. After I spent a couple of minutes cussing my luck, I acknowledged that I was going to have to find someone with a working phone. That was not going to be very easy, unfortunately, as I was out in the middle of nowhere. And that was also not going to happen unless I started walking. Soon, I spotted an old farmhouse off in the distance and headed toward it. A trip that would have taken half an hour on a normal day took almost an hour because of the oppressive heat. I had to take several breaks during the journey, but eventually, I made it. The area around the house looked more like a junkyard. Parts of old cars were spread about, and I had to weave through a maze of them to try to reach the front door. I knocked on the door for several minutes, but got no answer. Thinking maybe that the homeowner might be hard of hearing, I walked around and investigated the windows, hoping to see someone inside. At the side of the house, I spotted a telephone hanging on the wall just inside the kitchen. Now that I knew there was a phone there, I became excited and started calling out for someone. Even after walking all the way around, no reply came. I was about to give up until I saw a woman laying on a bed. I nearly banged on the window to try to get her attention, but I figured that might scare her, so I went back to the front door and let myself in. In hindsight, that was just as scary. Before I entered, however, I took a piece of paper from a notebook I carry with me and wrote out a note explaining what I was doing there. Even then, I called out several times as I approached the bedroom. Still, no answer. I continued toward the room. The closer I got to the woman, the more her appearance began to unnerve me. She was lying flat on her back and staring blankly at the ceiling. I had initially believed she was watching the television that was turned on in the room with her, but her eyes sat completely still. Regardless, I got closer, and once I was within a few steps, I handed her the note. When the note touched her hand, she did not react. This caused me to get closer, and this is when I realized something was very wrong. Her face had a very dry, almost mummified look to it. Her hair was a vibrant black, a color not often seen on older females. She had to have known I was there by that point, but her eyes stayed fixated. This is what caused me to lean in even closer and look into her eyes. Rather than being slightly bloodshot or moist like most people's, they had a shiny, glassy appearance, like they were fake. Despite this, not until I touched her did I know for sure that she was dead. I realized that perhaps she was a mannequin rather than a human, so I reached down and touched her bare hand. The texture of her skin was dry, but stone cold to the touch. The oddity of this was just beginning to really sink in when a loud creaking noise came from behind me. Without a second thought, I tore out of there and ran back down the road in the direction of my car. Within half a mile, I ran into an older man in a truck, and he agreed to give me a ride into town. I said nothing about my experience to him, and any time he attempted to make small talk, I said as absolutely little as I could. He let me borrow his phone to call my girlfriend, and she agreed to meet us at a gas station on the edge of town. When he let me out there, I thanked him, and he went on his way. Once I was safely inside my girlfriend's car, I borrowed her phone and called the police. I had not even told her about it yet, so the look of shock on her face as I described what I saw showed me what my expression likely was at the time when I discovered it. The cops said they would send a car out to the house to check out my claims. I called a wrecker next to pick up my car. The police never called me back, so after waiting 3 days, I called to inquire about what they found. It took a few moments to find a person aware of my call, but once I did, the officer said that he and his partner searched the entire property and found nothing out of the ordinary, especially no mummified woman. I thanked them and hung up. What happened after I fled, I can only guess. The noise behind me was probably the owner of the home, and he hid the woman's body, knowing that the cops were likely to be called. To tell you the truth, I am not sure what I saw in that house on that bed. I am positive that I saw a human lying on the bed, but that is all. More than once, I have been tempted to grab a camera and return to that house to get proof of my claims, but fear of the unknown and what else could be waiting for me if I did has stopped me. If the nightmares of her soulless eyes continue, however, I may have no other choice. I started my career working in sawmills back in 2007. I was hired for a portable sawmill in southwest Washington state. This mill was located, quite literally, in the middle of a forest. It was constructed in the early 1970s, and even in the short 30 years of its life, it seemed to have a decent amount of history inside of it. I worked the weekend graveyard shift, from 2:30 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. the following day, on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. I was a trim drop operator, and I had a partner who I was with. We were the only two who worked in this area. His name was Pete. We would take turns rotating through the night. One of us would run the drop, where you would drop out bad boards, chunks of garbage, and just anything else that could not be made into quality lumber. The boards that were left to be processed would enter a lugged, chained system and then be pulled through a scanner and then a trim box that would cut the lumber to length before taking them to the next area, which was the sorter. The other would sit at an operator's console about 20 feet away and watch monitors that displayed various parts of the machine and process flow. We rotated every few thousand boards to keep from being fatigued. One night, I was running the drop, and Pete was kicked back at the console station, reading away at the newspaper. Everything was just going normal as ever when I glanced over and noticed him peering up at the monitor of the outfeed with a puzzled look on his face. He jumped up and went walking down to the trimmer saw box and looked around it. He also looked at the outfeed. He then walked back, looking quite concerned, sat down, shrugged, and started reading again. This happened a second time, and by now, he had my attention. I threw up the skids to stop the flow of lumber and walked over to him and asked him what was up. There was a guy standing at the outfeed. I went down there to see what the hell was going on, and when I got there, he was gone, he said with a confused look on his face. This did not make sense because this was an area that was not accessible unless you stopped the machine and activated a catwalk that unfolds from the outfeed of the saw to allow access to a small platform on the opposite side of the machine. I asked him to point out where the guy was hanging. Pete pointed to the platform, slightly frustrated. I shook my head at him and laughed before running back to the drop to continue running lumber. Pete stayed fixed on the monitors now, newspaper folded up and thrown to the side. No more than 5 minutes went by before he jumped up and ran down to the saw box and outfeed again. This time, I threw the skids up and followed him. By the time we got there, there was nothing. He pointed across the lumber table, which was 30 feet wide, to the platform across the machine and yelled, "Who's over there? You're not allowed to be over here, god dang it." Both of us waited to see the man who had been on the monitor, but once again, there was nothing there. After a minute or two of looking, we decided to move back to our stations. I walked by the console station, glancing at the monitor and seeing nothing, and Pete followed shortly behind. By the time I made it to the drop to start running again, Pete held. I snapped over and saw him stabbing the monitor with his finger. He yelled at me to come look. I ran over and investigated the monitor. Sure enough, there was a guy. He was standing on the small platform Pete had pointed out. The monitor was small, grainy, and black and white, but we could make out that this guy was wearing a tin hard hat, a very dirty and worn button-up long sleeve with the sleeves either rolled up or ripped off, and very thick denim jeans of a dark color. He was just standing there, with his elbows on the handrail, looking at the lumber from the saw box. "Wait here," Pete yelled as he stealthily snuck down to the outfeed. As he closed in on the outfeed area to catch this guy red-handed for being in an area you cannot or should not be able to access while in operation, I looked back and forth at Pete on the monitor. About the time Pete made it to the saw box, the man on the monitor looked up into the camera and literally just faded away. I completely lost my cool. I felt a cold chill run down my back, accompanied by all the hairs on my arm standing up. I sprinted as quickly as I could to Pete, exclaiming, "That ain't a guy. It's no guy." Pete just stood there, dumbfounded. Both of us knew that we were looking at an empty platform, and we had no idea what we should do. We were quite disturbed now. Pete crossed his arms and thought before deciding we should call our foreman down to tell him this story. We walked back to the operator's station, and Pete grabbed the mic of the radio and called for the foreman. We ran operations until he arrived, both of us ready to bolt for the saw box in case we saw the entity again. The foreman showed up about 5 minutes or so later, and we stopped running and explained what had happened. The foreman did not look impressed, but he was smiling. He explained that we had probably just seen one of the old-timers. Back in the late 70s, we had a man who worked here who ran the chip bin station. And one day, arrogance got the best of him. Long story short, he got buried in a chip pile and was crushed and suffocated before he could get dug out. As homage to his previous career as a logger in the woods, people think that his ghost roams these halls. Other operators have had occurrences where they have witnessed this entity wandering around different machines, seemingly just watching the flow of lumber.